Hello and welcome to our cottage garden. I'm going to give you a complete tour today, so if you're new this will be a really good opportunity to familiarise yourself with the space, see what we've done with it over the years, and we'll talk you through what our aims are for each pocket of the garden. You've joined us on a really gorgeous sunny day. We're at the end of May and just about to go into June, so we're in those transitional days between spring and summer. And we did actually show you around a full garden tour about 2 years ago. You can watch that back if you want to see some of the changes that have happened between then and now. Quite a lot, to be honest. So I'm really excited to show you around today. A bit of context for you: we live in a cottage in Somerset that's about 250 years old. We've been here for 5 years, and the reason we fell in love with the house was because of the garden. I didn't have any garden knowledge when we came here, and we've been here 5 years, and my strategy has just been learn as you go, learn from mistakes, and try not to be too perfectionist, which can be a bit of a challenge, but you'll see walking around there's plenty of things that aren't perfect. We live here with our 2 dogs and our 3 runner ducks, which hopefully you'll get to meet in the course of the video. Here are the dogs at the moment, but let's get started. Down here we're just a couple of metres away from our kitchen, so I used this kind of rockery area to grow a few herbs. I've got some mint, some rosemary and some thyme, and so if I ever need these while I'm cooking I can pop outside and grab them. But they're really all easy perennial plants, and for the mint especially it's good to keep it contained in a small space because it has a tendency to spread and take over otherwise. We also have a collection of hosta plants down here because it's quite a shady spot, so we don't want things that need full sun. These were given to us by a family member with the intention of us moving them up to the pond, but we used this area for kind of storage and had them placed here and just fell in love with them. But we're really happy with the hostas down here, so we will reshuffle these slightly, but I think we are probably going to have a permanent hosta collection around the edge of the house. I've also got a clematis montana and a wisteria, and these were some of the first things that I planted when we moved in 5 years ago. They look really gorgeous in spring. The wisteria just flowered for the first time this year, so it was a game of patience with that one, but one of those things that's good to get in the ground as early as you can, and then before you know it you see it in flower. These steps I try to soften with irrigation, so that's these lovely daisy flowers, and they look really good this time of year, and they spread really easily as well. When they go to seed I just sprinkle the seeds on the steps and they continue to spread. I grow lots of strawberries here as well in the bed behind me, and this is just because if I grow them any further away from the house they get eaten by mice, so keeping them near the house with the watchful eye of the dogs is a really good strategy for pest prevention on those. But now let's move up the garden and I can show you some of the other areas. And in the border next to the steps I grow a collection of hellebores, so if you've ever seen our winter videos you'll see these when they are in flower. It's something I'm building up gradually over the years, as with most of the garden, but this soil was awful when we moved in. We had to do quite a lot of work top dressing it with compost to get it to be usable, and we did plant a few things like hollyhocks and buddleia that don't mind poor soil initially, just to get some life back in there and start breaking it up from underneath with the roots. But it's worked really well, and 5 years down the line we've got lots going on here. You can also see we've got some nepeta. I love long soft flowers around the kind of firmer structures like the steps. I just think it looks really beautiful and soft, so this is a favourite, and it's a really generous plant, and you can see in front of me the bees love it too. In the gaps things just self-seed freely. We've got forget-me-nots. These have more or less finished now and gone to seed, and you can see these will just spread around and self-seed everywhere. We get foxgloves popping up, a bit of comfrey, and some of the things that are more difficult to remove, but they're still beautiful plants. We will be changing this area slightly tomorrow. We've got a massive delivery of yew hedges coming in the aim of giving us a bit more privacy, so we're going to be lining either side with yew hedges. Really excited to get that done, and kind of kicking myself that we didn't do it earlier on. And that is the border at the top of the steps. You'll see as we move up the garden it's divided into small and flat levels, and we use each of these for kind of different reasons, and I love this way of gardening, and each space has its own kind of theme. So this first level we use for our wildlife pond that you can see next to me. It doesn't have much going on in the way of plants, and that's definitely something that we want to change in the future years, but it does have a lot of life in there, and there are hundreds of newts and frogs and insects too, and I can see a newt right now, which is really lovely. lovely. So this is such a valuable thing to have in the garden, and you really see a benefit in terms of slug control as well. So I grow hostas next to this, and normally they're something that are quite threatened by slugs, but because we've got newts and frogs, those eat the slugs and it makes it easier to grow those kinds of plants. So it's a really helpful thing to have in terms of wildlife, but also natural pest control, and it's beautiful. I just love sitting next to it and seeing the life that goes on this time of year. Above the pond we've got this smoke tree, and this was here when we moved in. I've opened this up quite a lot this week so that there's a better view up and down the garden, and I'm really glad I did it. This is another plant that's really popular with the bees, and you can still see there's quite a few on there where it's sent out its flowers for spring. I don't do much with the lawn here. It's mainly a part of the garden that's used by the dogs, so I don't want to be too precious about planting bulbs and naturalising things. We just keep it quite short so that the dogs can play it and there's a lower risk of ticks. And then the borders, again, we're going to be fiddling with these tomorrow, so they're going to be quite changed and they're a bit of a mismatch at the moment, but I do still enjoy the things that self-seed. We get so many foxgloves and aguilesias. This lower part of the garden is a really lovely sun trap as well, so we've got a table and chairs, and we love to sit out here and have our dinner on sunny days. The lawn is edged by some railway sleepers, which thankfully we didn't have to install ourselves. They were here when we moved in, and we're always so grateful for the things that people did before us that have lasted the years. And that's the first room of the garden. This is the second level of the garden, and I usually refer to this as my crocus lawn because I've planted thousands of Pickwick crocus bulbs underneath the grass, and in the start of spring it looks so beautiful. And I've made a point to do this close enough to the house that I can see it out the window if the weather's particularly miserable and I don't feel like getting outside. But again, the crocuses are really good forage for the early bees at the start of the year when not much else is in flower, and then we let the grass grow really long for about 6 to 8 weeks after they've finished flowering, and then we just mow it and use it again as a normal lawn for the dogs. We've got shade on one side and sun on the other, so it's a little bit tricky to have symmetry, and I've kind of just given up on trying. This side of the garden though is deeper shade and it's more difficult to do things with. I've got a few plants like a box hedge, a hydrangea, some hellebores, but it's a little bit more of a challenge. Again, we're going to put yews in tomorrow, which you can see we have done on the other side already, so hopefully we'll get a nice symmetrical hedge running along either side. And thankfully yew is a really adaptable hedge. It can go in the shade or the sun, so we should be able to get some symmetry once we've got those hedges in. You will notice as we start to move up the garden now, we've got some really beautiful damson trees that line either side, and these again have just self-seeded naturally over the years. I imagine these trees have been here for hundreds of years, so the gardens used to be used in a kind of shared small holding sense where people would grow food and raise animals, and you can imagine maybe these damson trees were part of their forage and have self-seeded over the years, and their offspring are here today, which is really cool. Potentially they are a bit crowded in some areas and might need thinning just so that they can have the best opportunity to grow, so we'll be fiddling with that once we get our hedges in tomorrow. But this time of year we just use the lawn for the dogs. Sometimes we let the ducks come out here. It's more of a recreational space than a curated one. Behind me you can see a small barn, and we had to renovate this after we moved in, so the walls were still standing but the roof was completely rotten. It was used to store logs for firewood, but we really wanted to get a flock of ducks, so we set our goal as repairing some of these structures, and then as a reward we bought the flock of ducks. This stone barn would have been part of the original small holding, so it's really cool that that's still here after all of those hundreds of years. And it was one of the first projects that we took on when we moved in 5 years ago. And that is our second bit of lawn. So next to the duck house we have this lovely stone flower bed, and although the stone was here when we moved in, this was completely covered in ivy, so it was quite a job for me to expose it and get some space to plant things. But after I did that I planted an assortment of shade loving plants, so we've got hellebores and then a couple of hydrangeas at the back, which I think get just about enough sunlight that they'll be able to flower, but I only put those in last year, so we will see in a couple of weeks time. But it's quite nice dappled sunlight on here. And then we've got two big plum trees at the back, including I think probably the biggest one we've got in the garden. So they're so high up we can't pick the plums, we just wait for them to fall and then collect them, and I usually make jam from them. I've put some Japanese anemones in here as well. These are called wild swan, but the main event is the hellebores at the start of the year. There's some beautiful cobbled stones down here that, again, I'm assuming are original to the house, so that's a really lovely feature. And I am trying to get some erigeron to flower in this area. Not quite successfully yet. I think I've got 3 or 4 plants, but I imagine that they will self-seed and hopefully take over this area to soften it a bit. We do get quite a lot of weeds sprouting, and I leave quite a lot of weeds in place around the garden. I think they're not that bad. I think we have been too strict in the way that we weed our gardens so rigorously, and actually a lot of them are just wildflowers that are good for the insects. In the border behind me, I grew some really lovely daffodils at the start of the year, so you can see these are finished now and the leaves are left. I know a lot of people do tidy these up by folding them over and then looping a leaf around to kind of bundle them. I haven't really had time to do that, so I've just left them, but they should return every year and be really beautiful in spring. But that is the area around the duck house. This is our 3rd area of lawn, and you can probably hear that we're right next to the ducks now. We've got a few things going on here, but I would say it's probably the area where I've focused most of my energy in the garden over the last year. We have a seed bed that was here when we moved in, and for the last 5 years I've used this to grow my tulips, but I have to rest it now because they weren't very healthy this spring and I think the soil needs to recover. We have a shed, and this is another thing that we had to rebuild soon after moving in. The foundation was fine, but we had a smaller wooden shed built on top of it that was so rotten. When our friend came to help us rebuild it, he said it was kind of lucky that it hadn't collapsed on us, so that was a bit scary. But he built this really beautiful shed for us and did some arched windows that are similar to the church that he lives in. He built around the elder tree that's flowering at the moment, which we think is a really cool feature. And we also installed a water butt and some guttering so that we can harvest rainwater for the garden too. So we're really happy with this. And then in the last couple of years, we've also wired water and electricity up here. So we've got the water butt that refills itself, and we can use that to change the ducks' water. And then we've wired in electricity so that we can have some lights in the evening and anything else that we need to charge, including power tools and that sort of thing. So that's made gardening a lot easier. I'd say the borders around here, probably for the most part in the garden, aren't finished yet. I am really gardening in like a dribs and drabs kind of way and building things up over the years, and partly because I'm learning as I go, partly because I fall in love with different plants throughout the years, but I also don't want to rush. I want each plant to feel really special, and doing it slowly means you can remember where you got it from, who gave it to you, and you can look at things and remember why you've got them. So while I'm stood here, I can see that we've got the wild swan Japanese anemones in flower, and I bought these after seeing so many of them on our honeymoon. We did a mini moon where we visited some gardens around the country, and they were something that I really loved, so bringing them into the garden reminds me of that time. We've also got a rose there called Silas Mana, and my friend gave us that as a wedding present, so that's really special. But that's one of the reasons I didn't want to sort of bring everything in instantly just from one garden centre. I want it to grow and be an expression of people and memories and just lovely things. Obviously the elephant in the room is this massive pile of logs next to me. So this doesn't live here permanently, don't worry, this is normally a bit of lawn, but we are currently moving around our bug hotel, and basically every time we cut down big trees and shrubs, we keep some of the branches and we just make piles of them around the garden so that the insects can use them as a habitat. And it's a really, really good thing to do in the garden. We're just moving them around at the moment because we've had to put some wiring in where they were situated. So next time you're here, this will be tidier, and please do give us a subscribe if you'd like to follow our cottage garden journey over the coming months. So you can see once we're in this bit of the garden that it starts going uphill instead of being levelled, and this does present some challenges for gardening, especially if we're moving heavy things around. And we also don't have direct road access, so it's really, really tricky to bring in bulk bags of compost, for example, or if we want to do any landscaping, getting the materials in for that. So those are some of the challenges that come with the garden. But I do love this kind of slope because it helps us have a really nice view from the house window. You can kind of see all of the layers at once and it compresses into one really lovely image. It does mean as well that we have slightly different weather conditions in different parts of the garden. For example, the way the water pools, because it runs down the hill and then gets stuck by the pond, it can get really boggy at the bottom of the garden, whereas here it's much better drainage. You can see behind me, this is an area where I keep the grass long. So we've just finished doing no mow may, which means part of the grass we've left really lush and long for the insects. And this is where I grow my spring flowering bulbs. I grow snowdrops, snake's head fritillary, fritillaries, daffodils, and then there's some lovely wild primroses and some bluebells in there too. This time of year though, I expect it to look quite messy, but I actually really like the seed heads on the snake's head fritillaries. I think they're beautiful and they're quite architectural in their own right. I don't normally like the way that seed heads look once flowers are finished, but I think they kind of look like the alliums that you see elsewhere in the garden, and they go really nicely with that. So I'm actually pleasantly surprised by those, but they are going over now and starting to drop their seed. So the aim is that these will naturalise over the years to come, and hopefully we'll get more impressive displays in consecutive years. But that is our third area of lawn. So up the hill slightly, we have these two flower borders. They both get a mix of sun and shade in different parts. So again, not too much symmetry, but I think a cottage garden is quite forgiving in that sense and is more of a happy jumble of plants anyway. You can see we have this really lovely oak tree that was obviously here before we moved in. We reckon it might be 30 to 50 years old. If anyone knows oak trees better, please do correct me, because I have absolutely no expertise in that area. It's not an ancient tree, it's relatively young as far as oak trees go, but it's still quite amazing. We also have this acer tree, which again was here when we moved in. We've got the elder tree and some more plum trees. So a really lovely assortment of trees, and they all bring us different things. One of the most unusual things about this area though is the big greenhouse. This is full of agaves mostly, and they are huge, bigger than me. I did do a little bit of tidying in here, and I did remove some of the cacti. Initially I wasn't sure that I wanted to keep them, and I wanted to turn it into more of an orangery or maybe grow some camellias in there, but over time I did fall in love with those huge agaves and decided to keep them. It needs a little bit of TLC. It could use the plaster being re-skimmed inside, so it's still a work in progress, as a lot of things are around the garden, but one day we'll get to it and maybe perfect it a little bit more. But I still think it's a really cool feature. And outside of summer we move our tables and chairs in here so that we have somewhere to sit in the winter that's a little bit warmer than the rest of the garden, and it's sheltered from the rain, and it makes a really lovely place to sit and read a book. The border next to me I edged with some willow recently, and you can watch, I think this is in my April garden tour, I show you the process of how I did that. I'm a complete beginner. I've done a few hurdles around the garden, but I don't have any real experience with it. But it was a really beautiful material to work with, and I'm so pleased with how it's come out. You can see at the moment we've got some alliums in flower. These are Mount Everest, and then we've got a couple of structural ligustrums in there as well that have been trained as standard. And this was something I did so that in winter, when everything dies back, there's a bit more of a kind of structured feel, because I didn't have a lot of evergreens when we moved in. The borders are still quite gappy. I let them fill with things like oxeye daisies that self-seed in naturally, but as I move some more perennials in, I will remove the self-seeded oxeye daisies. But I don't like to have bare soil. I either let weeds come in and cover the soil, or I'll have a natural mulch of compost or leaves or grass cuttings, but I try to keep the soil covered at all times. When we first moved in, this area was really overgrown. We had a bamboo plant, and it was one of the running varieties, so it would send really long roots and then send up another plant after you think you've got on top of it. So that covered most of this part of the garden, and it took years to get out. I still find small parts of it that have started shooting, so it's going to be an ongoing job for me to keep it under control, but we've tackled most of it now and been able to plant things largely in its place, which is amazing. We also had a really huge conifer tree in this area, and it was massive and unsightly and didn't bring much benefit to wildlife, so we cut that down a few years after moving in, and it really transformed this area. It brought in a lot more natural light, but it also gave space to the oak tree for it to grow. And even in those couple of years, I think it's been 2 or 3, the amount of growth that the oak tree has put on is actually quite amazing. I was looking at photos of it from a few years ago, and it was so much smaller, so I think it really does make a difference if you can open up space for the trees that are here. After we took the conifer tree out, we were able to get some fencing in, and we recently put these hazel hurdles on either side, and they make a really big difference to the privacy. We're gradually screening them with climbers, mostly some winter flowering clematis to give us an evergreen kind of screening, but also some flowers in winter when there's not much else going on. So next to me here we have the smaller greenhouse where I start my seedlings. It is looking a massive mess in there at the moment because I haven't had time to keep on top of it. But when we moved in, this was really covered in brambles and we had to clear them off, and I built the raised bed and the table from some old pallet wood that we got from a scrapyard. And then we have the polytunnel next to me as well, which is amazingly useful for growing things like melons, cucumbers, tomatoes, any of those heat-loving plants in summer. It's got some lovely summer fruiting raspberries next to it too, and these are covered in bees at the moment that are pollinating the flowers, so it won't be long until we get some fruit from those. I do like to grow things in kind of polycultures rather than neat lines. I think it's much better for the health of the soil, but also for a natural kind of pest control, and you don't tend to get overwhelmed with one pest from growing that way. So I have put some other things in here as well. I've got some hollyhocks at the back, which you can see here are just getting ready to flower for the first time after growing them from seed. I've got some chard and some strawberries in the lower level, some chamomile as well, and a rhubarb plant too. So a happy jumble of things in here. The polytunnel was another structure that we needed to repair on moving in. It did have a plastic sheet that was probably about 10 to 15 years old and had torn and become really badly damaged and just needed changing. So we did that with the help of my mother-in-law and brother-in-law, which was really helpful. I don't think we could have done it on our own. It was quite difficult getting the sheet over the top of the arches, but very much worth doing. We love having the polytunnel now. So let's go and take a look inside. It's really lovely and warm inside the polytunnel, but we are in the transitional stage now where I'm clearing out the spring things and getting the summer things in. So you can see I've got a mulch down of homemade compost just to improve the soil, and my young tomato plants have just been planted, which is so exciting. I love growing tomatoes. I've still got a few broad beans in because these fix some nitrogen in the soil, so they'll make it better when I do plant things like tomatoes in here. So we're midway between the transition, but it's a really amazing space and I absolutely love having a polytunnel. We recently installed an irrigation system, which you can see on the soil below me. So it waters itself every 3 days and it saves me trying to remember when I have and haven't watered it. So far we are loving the irrigation system, but summer I think will be the true test of how useful it is. I like to leave a few things in here to go to seed to encourage the pollinators to come in, and we get pollinators in here, we get pests, and then the birds come in and eat them. The food chain kind of looks after the pests for us. So you can see I've left a leek in that will have a really beautiful allium flower on the top. I've left some dill behind me which has these amazing yellow flowers on the top. I absolutely love those. And the other thing I do in here is I have a backbone of permanent plants to keep some structure in the soil. I've got a dwarf cherry tree, I've had a pomegranate bush but it didn't do very well, a goji berry bush, a couple of lemon trees and some dahlias that stay in here permanently too. So I'll probably add a few more perennial and permanent plants and then the annuals come and go around them. I got these bricks free from Facebook Marketplace. Someone was demolishing an old extension on their house and we drove them and then made the edging for the beds on either side with them, and I think they're really beautiful and I love that kind of find on Facebook Marketplace. The trellises I'm using for climbing things, so squashes, cucumbers, and also this grape that I started from a cutting. I think I started this in 2020, so I haven't had any fruit from it yet, but maybe this year will be our year. We are in our vegetable garden now, and this is an area that we worked on throughout lockdown. Again, it was something we did soon after moving in. So we've got 7 raised beds and most of these we use to grow perennial foods. We've got asparagus, perennial kale, sunchokes, perennial onions. There's some rhubarb, some chives, but there are a few vacancies for more perennial plants once I get my hands on some. We've got some tayberries and some grapes here as well. We also have a comfrey hedge which we use for making homemade plant food, and it's also another thing that the pollinators really love. The path through the middle we made with flagstones that were from our house but were too damaged to keep as a floor, so we restored a new one in the house and then brought the old ones out here to use as a path. We also put these arches over the middle, and I'm currently training a rose and some clematis to climb these, and then another rose behind me, but it's taking years because it's a rose that I started from a cutting, so it really was small. You can see that the garden kind of descends into complete wilderness as you move up through this part. It's not very manicured at all. We've got long grass everywhere and then a kind of meadowy area that we leave long for most of the year behind me. So that is the orchard. We've got a cherry tree, a fig tree, a pear tree and an assortment of apple trees as well, which is a really amazing thing to have, especially as autumn comes around and we get some fruit harvests from it. But it's beautiful this time of year because we get the cow parsley and lots of wildflowers and long, lush grass that the insects really love. So if you spend a bit of time in there, you'll see plenty of bees, but it is very wild. And one of the questions I get asked is, how do you keep it looking tidy with it being a wild garden? And if you watch these videos, you'll just know that I don't. It looks nice up until May, and then after that it does go quite long and crispy, but you can hear the crickets and the other insects in there, and it just makes it really difficult to trim. And I think it's worth keeping some parts of the garden messy and letting the wildlife use it. At the very top behind the orchard, we also have another wildlife pond and some compost bins, and that part of the garden is well and truly wild. I haven't had the time to look after it much at all, so it is a little bit too overgrown and could use a bit more attention. Maybe I'll get around to it one day, but we've got 3 big compost bins where we take our grass cuttings and any garden waste, and then I leave them for about a year and return them to the raised beds. And I also compost in situ in these raised beds, so I will add old vegetable plants and grass cuttings and then top them with a layer of compost, and it will all gradually infuse into the soil and build a really lovely rich soil to grow our food in. But that is more or less our cottage garden as a complete tour for you. I hope you've enjoyed having a look around, and please do subscribe to our channel if you've enjoyed having a look around, and we can show you what we're up to over the coming months. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.